Scott read my mind. One of the things I failed to mention to you but wanted to was that Jim and Marina Noyes are here with us this evening. We're really wanted to call attention to that for all of you to get to see them and hear about the work that they're doing in Ukraine. We're really happy that y'all are here tonight. I'm glad to see you. Glad to see you again. You may also have already noticed that we have a repaired or replaced rather microphone cord. So I'm going to have to find another way to keep y'all awake without the loud random noises that were happening on Sunday while I preached. Hopefully we won't be dealing with that anymore. So we are continuing tonight in our series in the life of David, Chasing God's Heart. We have some awesome David stories to talk about tonight. I mean, some of my favorites, some of the ones that I just really think cement David's legacy as a man after God's own heart. So we're going to be in 1 Samuel, primarily in 1 Samuel 24, but we're also going to spend a little bit of time in 1 Samuel 26 as well. But before we dive into those stories, I do, as we often have in this series, want to start with a prayer of David that I think just really goes very well with the stories we have tonight, and that is in Psalm 4. Psalm 4 is a lovely psalm. It even sounds a little bit Proverbs-y in the middle. I think you'll see what I mean. And the reason that I chose this psalm, and the reason that I think it fits so well with our passages from 1 Samuel tonight, is because this psalm helps us to see what David believes can overcome anger. What does it take to overcome anger? Well, this psalm helps us to answer that question. It says, "Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. O men, how long shall my honor be turned into shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him." Here's the part that sounds kind of like Proverbs to me. "Be angry and do not sin. Ponder in your own hearts on your beds and be silent. Offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, 'Who will show us some good?' Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. You have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound." And this part's important too. "For in peace I will both lie down and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety." So what are the things in life that are stronger than anger? What does it take to face anger in our lives, which we may, and overcome it? That is a lesson that I think David's life and his prayers really help us to grasp. You know, to tell you the truth, I don't really much enjoy talking about anger. I think most people would probably consider me to be a fairly even-keeled person, especially when there's not a round orange ball involved in it, or if I'm not playing Ninja Turtles on Super Nintendo with my brother in my childhood bedroom. I tend to be a pretty calm, pretty even-keeled person, but I can also tell you this. I know what it's like to be angry, too. I know what that feels like. I don't like how that feels. Anger is a really powerful force. I can remember a time or two when I had a hard time sleeping. You ever been through that? Because I was angry. I can remember a time or two just wanting to go for a walk because anger was something I was dealing with. It's a powerful force, and I don't like how it feels. But even the calmest person among us knows how that feels. And if you were here last week as Colby preached to us, you know also that David knows how anger feels. After all, in our study, For the past several chapters, David has been doing what? He's been running from Saul. He's been running for his life. Saul has no reason to want to kill him, and yet he's been chasing him all across the countryside and land, trying to put an end to David's life and his claim to the throne. And then, as Colby showed us last week in chapters 21 and 22 and in Psalm 52, this truly terrible thing happens. David stops for help with these priests who help him along, help him as he runs from Saul. And when Saul finds out that these priests have helped him, what does he do? He kills them. All of them. He actually goes through and wipes out their whole village. All because they lended a hand to David. And David is just gutted by this. He writes Psalm 52 about this event, and we read it last week. It's just like an open wound, full of hurt, full of anger. We wrestled with that a little bit last week. But our question for tonight is not, why is David angry? Our question for tonight is not even, is it right for David to be angry? What I want to talk about tonight is when David is angry. And when we are angry, what can we do to overcome that? What does David do when he's angry that makes him to be a man after God's own heart? What is it about David that he is able, not once but twice, to spare the life of Saul, his enemy, even as Saul tries to take his own? That's our question for tonight, and we find a bit of an answer in these stories. 1 Samuel 24 and verse 1 is where we're going to begin. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, "Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi." So then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all of Israel, and he went to seek David and his men in front of the Wild Goats Rocks. I'm not sure where that is, but Saul's got his 3,000 men, and he's going to hunt down David. And so he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself, but he does not know that David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. And the men of David say, "This is it. This is what we've been waiting for." The men of David say to him, "Here is the day of which the Lord has said, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you." David, this is your chance. Saul has been hunting you down, and now the hunter, he's right there in your hands. God must have delivered him to you for this very moment. You see, in the eyes of David's men, David has every reason to be angry, and he has every opportunity to retaliate right here in front of him. But what does David do? Then David arose and stealthily cut off the corner of Saul's robe. And that's it. And then get this. Afterward, David's heart struck him. He was stricken of heart because he had cut off even a corner of Saul's robe. And so he said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up, he left the cave, he went on his way. And then afterwards, David also arose, he went out of the cave and called out after Saul, "My Lord the king." Can you imagine Saul's surprise? When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down with his face to the earth and paid homage to Saul. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of the men who say, 'Behold, David seeks your harm'? Behold, This day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hands in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my Father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. Skipping down just a little bit to verse 12. David says to Saul, may the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you. But my hand shall not be against you. And so, verse 16, as soon as David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, is this your voice, my son David? Saul lifted up his voice and he wept. And he said to David, you are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. David spares Saul's life. Can you believe that? Saul cannot believe that. And to take it one step further, he has the opportunity to do it again. We don't have time to read it tonight, but in chapter 26, pretty much the same kind of scene unfolds again, and David finds himself in the exact same position he was before. Saul has continued to hunt him down even after he spared his life, even after he wept aloud and said, David, my son. Saul just keeps on hunting him, trying to put an end to him. Doesn't seem like he learned a thing, and David has another shot. But David does the same thing he did before. He spares his life a second time. It makes me wonder, how is it that David, who had so much reason that he could have been angry and acted on that anger, how does David, in moments like these moments, choose a better path? How does David overcome his anger when he had every opportunity to act on it? You know, to me, I find it helpful to think about David overcoming anger from a couple of angles. In fact, if you will bear with me tonight, I have found it interesting, maybe a little helpful this week, to actually diagram out 3 angles. I've got a little picture of a triangle I'm going to show you here in a second for thinking about the way that David responds to anger in a good way. You know, very often when I am angry with someone else, I often think about my relationship in 2 dimensions. So there's me, and then there's whoever it is that I'm angry with. And that's the problem. There's me and there's the person I'm angry with. And that's really what I'm thinking about. But you know, there's actually a 3rd dimension to all of our relationships. What is that? The 3rd dimension to every relationship, of course, is God. All of our relationships play out before God, and all of our relationships relate to our relationship with God. And in my mind, every part of David's good response to anger keeps this 3rd dimension, his relationship with God, firmly in view. So, for example, if we look at the case of David and Saul, the first angle I want to look at is the way that David pursues peace. So, David's actions towards Saul don't just affect Saul. David's actions towards Saul are a part of his relationship with God. And at the end of the day, David has to ask himself, will I behave towards Saul in a way that I can be at peace before God? This seems to be the question that David is wrestling with in Psalm 4. Remember how he said there, be angry, yet do not sin. And he seems to be kind of putting a limit on how far he will allow anger to go, because anger, if it leads us to sin, disturbs our peace with God. We read a moment ago from Ephesians when it quotes from this very same psalm. Paul, writing to the Ephesians, says, be angry and do not sin. And just like in that psalm, he sets a limit. He says, don't let the sun go down on your anger. Don't let your anger get out of control. Put a limit on what you will do. And why do we do that? You don't want to give an opportunity to the devil, because it's not just about what David does toward Saul. It's about what David does toward Saul before God. Those relationships are connected. So David in his psalm says, ponder in your own hearts on your beds, but take a moment and be quiet. Think about what you're about to do. Set a limit for yourself. Because the goal is that in peace, I will both lie down and sleep before God. In the face of anger, David wants to make sure that what he does at the end of the day, he can be at peace about before his God. And so he's not going to go too far. Remember in the story how even just cutting off the corner of Saul's cloak causes David to have this pang of this heart pain. He's stricken in his heart because he cut off the robe of Saul. I think that's just a sign of a person who just desires so strongly to be right before his God that he doesn't even want to cut the robe, the corner of the robe of the king. He realizes it's not just about me and Saul. It's about me and Saul before God. There's another relationship at stake. So that first angle is David's pursuit of peace. Peace before God. And he can be at peace when he controls his anger and doesn't act on it in ways that aren't pleasing to God. And that leads us to our second angle as well, which is another way that David can have peace. David can have peace in a God that he can trust. A God that he can trust to make things right. See, David lives with this belief that there is a God. And this God is the God not just of David, but of Saul too. And of everyone. But that includes his enemies. And this God is every bit as merciful as he can be. And he's every bit as just as he needs to be. This God is in control. And so David's part in overcoming anger is he's got to trust God. That God's plan is going to make things right. So when David's men whisper in his ear, David, this is your chance. You could take him now. You could be done with all of this. How does David respond? Well, we read in verse 12 when he says, may the Lord judge between me and you, and may the Lord avenge me against you. But I am not going to do that. I'm going to trust in God to take care of this when he's ready. In chapter 26, when this thing happens again, David says something almost identical the second time. As the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him down, if that's his will, or his day will come to die, or he'll go down in battle and perish. if that's God's will, but the Lord forbid that I should put my hand against the Lord's anointed. You see what David's saying, right? I am going to leave it to God's will. I'm going to trust in him because he is the God both of me and him, and God will deal with me and him as he chooses. To me, it takes a remarkable amount of trust to not lash out in anger and rather choose this kind of attitude. But I think that's what we're called to strive for. I was thinking about the words of Romans chapter 12 when it tells us, beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And there's a really good reason for this. If your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink, for by doing this you'll heap burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. You see, this is the attitude of one who has learned to trust in God, who is in control. And if you do trust in God, you're free. You don't have to make it right. You can focus on not being overcome by evil and even doing good to those who harm you because God is in control. So you just do your part. If we can arrive at that kind of trust, I think there's freedom in that. We trust that God will be sovereign over our struggles, and that we can depend on him. So the verse in Psalm says, be angry and do not sin. And it ends with this reminder, put your trust in the Lord. So the first angle, pursuing peace. I don't want to act on anger in a way that's going to disturb my peace with God. The second one, preserving trust. I trust that God is in control, and that frees me. That I don't have to retaliate. I can even do good and trust in God. And then there's this last angle to look at, the perspective of value, which is just a cringeworthy way of trying to get them all to be aligned there. But what I'm trying to say here is that David strives to see even his enemy in the way that God sees that person. Does that make sense? David is striving to see what God sees, the value that God sees in the person, even the person that he may be very angry with, even the person who's done so much wrong to him. So did you notice, what does David continually call Saul in the passage we just read? What does he keep calling him? You know, if we were able to look at both passages, the two times that David spares Saul's life, one time he calls him by his name, calls him Saul. But 7 times in those passages, he calls him something else. I know that's really small. He calls him the Lord's anointed. Over and over again, he keeps calling him the Lord's anointed, because that is how David sees him. And every time David calls him the Lord's anointed, he follows it with a reason that he is not going to do any harm to the Lord's anointed. We won't read them all, but the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to the Lord's anointed. I will not raise my hand up against the Lord's anointed. Who could raise their hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? The Lord forbid that I raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. Do you see the way that David is striving to see even his enemy the way God sees his enemy? David sees Saul, and he doesn't just see a sorry king, and he is a sorry king. David sees Saul, and he doesn't just see a toilsome foe that he just can't get rid of, and as soon as he got rid of him, things would just be better. he doesn't just see that. He sees the Lord's anointed. And in the way that David treats Saul, Saul sees what David sees in him. So in chapter 26, after the second time that David spares Saul, Saul says, "I've done wrong. Come back, my son David, for I will never harm you again." That's not true. But this next part's important. "I'll never harm you again," Saul says, "because my life was precious in your sight today. I've been a fool and have made a great mistake." Saul sees the way that David treats him, and he says, "It must be true that my life was precious in your sight today." David sees even Saul's life as precious, even though he has every reason to be angry with him. And that may be part of what motivates him to choose a better path. David himself actually uses that same word to describe Saul. "As your life," he says to Saul, "was precious today in my sight, so may my life be precious in the sight of the Lord." Learning to see what God sees. Learning to trust in God to make things right. Learning to live in ways that seek peace with God in the way that we deal with anger. These seem to be some of the key ways that David is overcoming anger when, if you ask me, it would have been really easy to give in. And maybe some of these things are things that we might need to hear tonight as well. Could it be that the next time you are angry, it would be good to stop and ask, stop and remember, it's not just about my actions to him or to her. It's about my actions to him before God. And I want to be at peace with God in the way that I handle this situation. Maybe we could stop and remember that it's God who is in control over my life and theirs. And I don't need to take it into my own hands to retaliate or get back at somebody because I'm free to be good to them and let God take care of the rest. Maybe we can strive, as hard as it is, to even see the person that we're angry with as precious in God's sight. Because we know that that is the way that God sees our lives. And I'll close with these words from Romans. A reminder that God demonstrated his love for us in that while we were sinners, he saw us as precious in his sight. So precious, in fact, that Christ died for us. And it's true that even while we were enemies, God did this for us through the death of his Son. And if he did that, how much more surely, having been reconciled, will we be saved by his life? Maybe tonight you need some prayers and encouragement to deal with some sort of anger that you're facing in your life. I will say that I don't think it's just simply a matter of having more knowledge that helps us to get over these things, but rather you may need prayer or support from someone else or practice. It may take time. It may take patience. But maybe as you use these things, what we've learned tonight from David may be helpful to you as well in the way we see someone else when we're struggling to see them as God sees them. Maybe tonight you're touched by the way that God sees us as precious in his sight, and how even more than David, he sees the best in us and the best hopes he has for us, even when it's hard to see. Maybe you're ready to respond to the gospel of one who loved us enough to die for us, even when we were opposing him in sin, And if we're raised with him in baptism, we know that he will give us a precious name in his sight. However you may be called or challenged, we give a moment to respond now while we stand, while we sing.